Ukraine said its troops were holding out against pro-Moscow forces in the eastern salt mining town of Soledar as more than 500 civilians including children were trapped there. Fighting. The ultranationalist contract militia Wagner, run by an ally of Russian President Putin, claims to have taken Soledar after intense fighting that it said had left the town strewn with Ukrainian dead. Ukraine has acknowledged Russian advances and said fighting was still fierce in Soledar. A capture of Soledar, which had a pre-war population 10,000, would be Moscow's most substantial gain since a series of retreats throughout much of the second half of 2022. Moscow's February invasion of Ukraine, the biggest land war in Europe since World War II, has resulted in more than 50,000 reports of alleged war crimes, said Ukraine's top war crimes prosecutor Yuri Borisov. The reports of alleged torture by pro-Moscow forces include electric shocks to genitals and other parts of the body, beatings, various forms of suffocation and sexual violence. Military. Kremlin watchers are examining Russia's latest switch of battlefield leadership after Valery Gerasimov, chief of the military's general staff, was unexpectedly given direct command of the invasion. Russia could raise the upper age limit for citizens to be conscripted as soon as this spring, a senior lawmaker has said, as part of Moscow's plans to boost the number of Russian troops by 30%. The commander of Russian ground forces visited Ukraine's neighbor Belarus to inspect a joint force stationed there. For now, northwest Ukraine's border with Belarus is a landscape of burst river banks, thick mud and waterlogged fields, so a Russian assault from there soon seems unlikely. Economy. Russian state budget revenue from oil taxes declined in December to 511.7 billion rubles, $7.6 billion, the lowest since March 2021, according to data from the Finance Ministry, following a slide in oil prices. Car sales in Russia collapsed by 58.8% in 2022, the Association of European Businesses, AEB, said, as the industry reels from the impact of Western sanctions. A Russian-installed official in Ukraine's Donetsk region said on Thursday that pockets of resistance remained in the Ukrainian town of Soledar, undermining claims that the town had been taken by Russian forces. Yevgeny Prigozhin, the powerful head of the Wagner private military group whose soldiers are fighting to capture the town, had said on Wednesday that Soledar was under the complete control of Russian forces. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has ridiculed those claims, and independent analysts say fighting is likely ongoing in the town. The Kremlin and Russian Defense Ministry have remained quiet on the situation around the town. In its daily military briefing on Thursday, the Russian Defense Ministry said only that offensive actions in the Donetsk region were continuing successfully, with no reference to Soledar. If Russian forces do manage to capture the town, it would mark the first territorial advance in the conflict by Russia since last July. Western military analysts also disputed Prigozhin's claims his forces had taken the town. Russian forces have not yet fully captured Soledar despite recent Russian advances, analysts at the Institute for the Study of War wrote. The bodies of 54 fallen defenders of Olenivka in Donetsk Oblast have been returned to Ukraine in a transfer organized with the mediation of the International Committee of the Red Cross, and their DNA is now being examined, the Reintegration Ministry reported on January 12. Over 50 Ukrainian prisoners of war were killed by an explosion in Russian-occupied Olenivka, Donetsk Oblast, on July 29. Ukraine said that, days before the attack, Russians singled out Ukrainian members of the well-known Azov regiment, who were captured in Mariupol and were awaiting a prisoner exchange, to a separate part of the prison building, the one that was destroyed. Ukrainian authorities said that Russia either hit the prison with artillery or blew it up from inside. According to Ukraine's Prosecutor General's office, Russia likely used a thermobaric munition at the Olenivka prison. Russia has accused Ukraine of attacking the prison with HIMARS, a high-precision rocket system. Units of the anti-aircraft missile forces of the Air Force destroyed a Russian Su-25 attack aircraft in the east, and an Orlan-10 tactical UAV in the south of the country, the Air Force's message reads. Since the beginning of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Russia has lost more than 20,000 pieces of equipment, according to daily enemy loss figures compiled by the Ukrainian military's general staff. The losses include 285 warplanes, 276 helicopters, and 1,865 drones of various types as of January 12. The Air Force has also shot down 723 Russian cruise missiles. The fight in the Donbass has become the epicenter of the war in Ukraine as Russia moves in special forces, and Kyiv warns the next few months will prove decisive in the outcome of the war. In an assessment Thursday, the UK Defence Ministry said Russia had likely redeployed some of the 76th Guards Air Landing Division of its Elite Airborne Forces, VDV, to the front lines around Kreminna in the Luhansk region, some 50 miles north of where the most brutal warfare is taking place on the Soledar-Bakhmut axis in Donetsk. The fight for Soledar, less than 10 miles northeast of Bakhmut, has drastically escalated in recent weeks after Russia employed its Wagner mercenary group on the city in an attempt to expand its eastward position in the Donbass. On Thursday, Ukraine's Deputy Defense Minister Hanna Maliar said fierce fighting continues in Soledar, countering claims made by Moscow Wednesday when it said its forces had captured the salt mining town. Wagner Group chief Yevgeny Prigozhin on Wednesday said his forces had taken all of Soledar and killed 500 Ukrainian troops. But Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky rejected these claims and said Moscow and its propagandists are trying to pretend that some part of our city of Soledar, a city that was almost completely destroyed by the occupiers, is allegedly some kind of Russia's achievement. U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin told reporters Wednesday that the situation was too fluid to make any assessment on battlefield gains at this time. Ukraine's Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council, Alexei Danilov, on Thursday warned that the deadly fighting is expected to ramp up even more as Moscow prepares for a major counteroffensive. Kyiv has warned for weeks that Russia is planning a large-scale counterattack to try and secure territorial wins in Ukraine and end what has become an 11-month war of attrition. The attack involved the coordinated work of Special Operations Forces soldiers, artillery gunners, and rocket troops, the General Staff said. According to the Army Command, clusters of enemy troops were detected in several areas near Soledar by the Special Operations Forces of the Ukrainian Army. Artillery was then used to destroy the enemy positions. A Tochka-U tactical missile system was also used to attack one of the enemy positions. As a result of the attacks, the destruction of more than 100 enemy troops was confirmed. In the first weeks of 2023, Russia has devoted maximum effort to trying to capture Soledar, but Ukrainian defenders continue to defend the Donbass town. Despite the extreme pressure of enemy attacks and claims from Russian propaganda, the Ukrainian command says Soledar has not been captured by Russian forces. The village lies about 11 kilometers to the northeast of the Donbass town of Bakhmut, which Russia has been attempting to capture for months, at the cost of thousands of Russian soldiers' lives. The town, though heavily damaged in the fighting, remains under Ukrainian control. As Russian strikes on Ukraine have intensified in recent months, Ukrainian authorities have set themselves the task of investigating Moscow's war crimes against civilians. Our special correspondents Luke Shrago, Melina Hute, and Olga Ivashchenko were given special access to one of the few areas where missile debris is collected in the Kharkiv region. The remains of Russian strikes on the city of Kharkiv alone stretch for hundreds of meters. Across the country, investigators are cataloging fragments of ballistic and cruise missiles that have fallen on Ukrainian soil, documenting what they consider to be Russian war crimes against civilians. Lubinets said that this was probably the first time the Russian side had come up with some workable proposals on humanitarian questions. We are exchanging POW and MIA lists, information. The issue of the missing people was in focus. There is positive news: our citizens and heroes, who were considered dead, were confirmed alive by the Russian side, 23 of our guys. This is great news. Lubinets said they also discussed the issue of Ukrainian civilians held captive by Russia since 2014. The Kremlin's separate list of political prisoners includes 158 Ukrainians, most of whom are Crimean Tatars. He added that according to various reports, Russia has detained up to 20,000 civilians on Ukrainian territory since February 24. The ombudsman stressed that this is probably the first time Russia has agreed to exchange missing persons lists and report where Ukrainian citizens are now and what their condition is. Russia said Thursday that its forces are edging closer to capturing a salt mining town in eastern Ukraine, which would mark an elusive victory for the Kremlin but come at the cost of heavy Russian casualties and extensive destruction of the territory they claim. More than 100 Russian troops were killed in the battle for Soledar over the past 24 hours, Ukraine's Donetsk governor Pavlo Kyrylenko said in televised remarks. Russian forces are using mortars and rockets to bombard Soledar in an unrelenting assault, struggling for a breakthrough after military setbacks have turned what the Kremlin hoped would be a fast victory into a grinding war of attrition that has dragged on for nearly 11 months with no end in sight. Civilians are trying to survive amid that bloodbath as the Russians are pressing their attacks, Kirilenko said. Serhiy Cherevity, a spokesman for Ukraine's forces in the east, said Soledar was hit by Russian artillery more than 90 times in the past day. Soldar's fall would be a prize for a Kremlin starved of good battlefield news in recent months, after losing the significant city of Kherson in December. It would also offer Russian troops a springboard to conquer other areas of the eastern Donetsk province that remain under Ukrainian control, particularly the nearby strategic city of Bakhmut. The Russians' tactic in the assault on Soledar is to send 1 or 2 waves of soldiers, many from the private Russian military contractor Wagner Group, who take heavy casualties as they probe the Ukrainian defenses, a Ukrainian officer near Soledar told the Associated Press. When Ukrainian troops suffer casualties and are exhausted, the Russians send in another wave of highly trained soldiers, paratroopers or special forces, to get a new toehold on the battlefield, said the Ukrainian officer, who insisted on anonymity for security reasons. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov praised the selfless and courageous action of Russian troops, which he said is helping them to press forward in Soledar. Peskov, however, stopped short of confirming a claim by Wagner Group owner Yevgeny Prigozhin, who boasted about capturing Soledar on Wednesday. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky vowed that the troops defending Soledar will be guaranteed ammunition and everything necessary. Ukrainian officials also said they were taking note of personnel changes at the top levels of the Russian military command, describing them as a sign that Moscow isn't achieving what it had hoped. At the United Nations, Ukraine's first deputy foreign minister Emine Zaporova told the Security Council that Ukraine will seek a General Assembly vote on a resolution supporting Zelensky's 10-point peace formula that includes the restoration of Ukraine's territorial integrity and the Russians' withdrawal. The plan that Zelensky presented to the Group of 20 meeting in Bali, Indonesia in November also includes the release of all prisoners, a tribunal for those responsible for the Russian aggression, and security guarantees for Ukraine. The continuing conflict on the battlefield is becoming increasingly dangerous to the civilian population in Ukraine and to the world. Russia's consistent missile attacks on the civilian infrastructure, to deny civilians far from military targets the basic elements of life such as electricity, heat and water, are ongoing war crimes. Human atrocities continue to be discovered as Ukraine reclaims Russian-occupied territories. Ukraine is not going to surrender to Russia and give up its sovereignty. Russian President Vladimir Putin is unlikely to politically survive a battlefield loss to Ukraine. Putin needs an off-ramp that he can position to his citizens as having achieved the initial purposes for sending troops to Ukraine. It seems under Resolution Number 377, the UN General Assembly could enforce a ceasefire and install a multinational peacekeeping force. Rather than oppose this action, Putin could spin it as achieving the goals he announced for the invasion, eliminating the Nazi influence, preventing Ukraine from invading Russia, and protecting Russian-speaking people in eastern Ukrainian, all secured by the UN actions. The Russian annexation of Crimea and the eastern districts would be negotiated after the current conflict ends. The UN should insist on supervising these negotiations, with the threat of facing a vote in the General Assembly to lose their Security Council seat if Russia does not agree to cancel annexation and withdraw from Ukrainian territory. President Volodymyr Zelensky recently made a courageous journey to the United States to address to a joint session of Congress regarding the needs Ukraine has to defend its democracy and territorial integrity on the battlefield. Congress has approved an appropriation of about $45 billion in 2023 to enable Ukraine to survive Russia's attacks. But this approach will only prolong the suffering of the Ukrainian population during the coming cold winter, and ensure that the destruction of Ukraine's civilian infrastructure and the ongoing human atrocities and war crimes would continue for perhaps another year. U.S. leadership in the UN General Assembly to force a vote on action to end the military conflict under a UN-enforced ceasefire could end this illegal conflict without further suffering in Ukraine or further investments from the US and NATO in weapons. It is impossible to say the exact losses the Russian army has on this axis, Podolyak said. But it's not 1,000 or 2. It's 10,000, 15,000 or even 20,000 troops over the entire time of hostilities at Bakhmut and Soledar. They don't count losses there. The official was presumably talking about total combat losses, including wounded soldiers, and not just those killed in action. According to him, Russians threw on Soledar practically all combat-ready units they had, including the remnants of their professional army, paratroopers and Wagner mercenaries. Podolyak argues that the occupation of the won't help Moscow turn the tide of the war. Earlier, Ukraine's Operational Command East spokesman Serhiy Cherevy reported that Russia had deployed the bulk of its, including Wagner's mercenaries, near Soldar in Donetsk Oblast. According to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, since the start of the full-scale invasion, total combat losses of the Russian military are at 113,390 troops. The decision to demote the commander of Russia's forces in Ukraine just 3 months after he was tapped for the job is a sign that Russian President Vladimir Putin is contending with an internal power struggle, according to a new assessment from the Institute for the Study of War, ISW. Russia's Ministry of Defense on Wednesday said it was replacing General Sergei Surovikin as commander of its forces in Ukraine with General Valery Gerasimov, chief of the Russian General Staff, the nation's highest-ranking military officer. Gerasimov's assignment is likely an effort to weaken the influence of critics of the Russian Ministry of Defense and a signal for Prigozhin and other actors to reduce their criticism of the MOD, per ISW's assessment. Their pointed and public criticism of Russia's military commanders has undermined the mass mobilization ordered by Putin, with a possibility it could put the lie to officially sanctioned accounts of the war and even lead to conflict between the well-connected elites upon which Putin's rule depends. Gerasimov being named commander of Russia's forces in Ukraine is confirmation, if we needed it, that there will be serious offensives coming from Russia, Galeotti said in tweets, adding that he suspects Putin has unrealistic expectations again. Russian leaders expected a swift victory in Ukraine, but instead has suffered staggering losses over nearly 11 months and seen its military embarrassed and downgraded on the global stage. After failing to take Kyiv in the early months of the war, Russia turned its attention to Ukraine's east. Ukraine launched a counteroffensive in August that saw it regain significant chunks of occupied territory over the weeks that followed, and by November saw Russian forces retreat from Kherson, the first major city Russia captured after invading. Russia has since focused much of its efforts on taking the city of Bakhmut in the Donetsk region, leading to heavy, fierce fighting. The pace of the fighting has slowed significantly since the initial days of the invasion, with the conflict morphing into a grinding war of attrition. It's unclear whether the recent change in leadership in Ukraine will drastically alter Russia's narrowing options on the battlefield.